Thank you so much, Jack, for joining us.
Glad to be here.
Do you think that Nigel Farage should try to destroy the Conservative Party?
Well, I hope he does. I certainly hope he does. I mean, look, we've got the same problem in the United States where we've got, so we have the establishment and then we have MAGA. And the way American politics works, because we have the two-party system, is that our various populist movements exist within the party. So they exist. So we are the MAGA wing that exists inside the Republican Party. And so at times we're forced to work with the establishment, but by and large, our greatest joys come when we are able to destroy, crush, disrupt, and dismember the establishment and their machinations to achieve our victories for the people and, of course, for our country. And so if Nigel, by the same token, is able to do so, then I think that he should drive the Conservatives all the way down to zero. Absolutely down to zero. He talks about net zero migration. I think we should have net zero Tories.
So you support the zero seats campaign?
I love the zeros. Look, 0 seats for the elites. 0 seats campaign. It's fantastic. It's wonderful. This is the way it needs to be, because if there's ever a chance, if there's ever a real chance that we are going to see actual change, and we face so many of the same problems, the mass immigration that's going on, the complete loss of culture that's going on. These are facing the entire West, and the UK and the United States. Unfortunately, from my perspective, it seems the UK is a bit further gone than the United States in some respects. And but at the same time, I feel like what you've done in your politics is actually show, number one, with Brexit, the ability to shrug off the globalists and fight them tooth and nail to actually do something to stand up for your country. Now, we were able to do so in the same year with the election of Donald J. Trump. So I'm hoping that this fight against the Western Atlanticist elites will continue on both fronts.
You mentioned immigration. This is one of the major reasons why the Conservatives in Britain have lost a lot of support.
Good.
They've flooded the country with many immigrants from all over the world, Africa, Asia, and so on in the last few years. And in the United States, Biden has done the same thing. He's opened the borders and millions of people have come to the US. If Trump wins in November, do you think he should instigate mass deportations?
Absolutely. No, we absolutely have to look. The crisis that we're facing now in terms of housing, in terms of healthcare, in terms of transport, in terms of inflation, in terms of so many things are exacerbated by the fact that, no, they'll lie, by the way, and tell you it's only 10 million or maybe 15 million. But the truth of the matter is we don't even know. That Joe Biden doesn't even know. I don't even think the Department of Homeland Security knows how many mass illegal immigrants are here in this country that have crossed that border since 2021 when Biden has taken office. But we can see the effects. We can see the effects on housing and education and healthcare and all of it. And there's no question that this has been a complete rot on our system. It's a complete rot. And not only, by the way, for the system writ large, but also for the people who are at the lowest end of the system, the people who are working class, the people who are now in direct competition with those people. It is driving their wages down because it creates downward pressure on working class wages. And so now you're competing with all the people who are standing out, in the parking lot of Home Depot. Look, when I was when it was the 1990s or early 2000s, let's say, when we first started to see this phenomenon of the Home Depot parking lot, you'd go there on a Saturday morning and you might see a dozen guys there. Now it's dozens and dozens of people, and they're from all over the world, and contractors go in. And so this not only should it be mass deportation, that's for sure, but also, number two, we need to start going after the people that are directly tied into profiting from this with the E-Verify system, which people think it's just about verifying. Yeah, that's true. But it's also about punitive controls and taking action against corporations and small businesses and other businesses that are profiting off of these lawbreakers coming into our country.
You talk about deportations. Are we talking about the illegal immigrants only, or are there anyone else who should be deported? And what kind of numbers would you look at in terms of the deportations?
Well, of course, you've got to triage it. So you've got to talk about, number one is violent criminals, and Trump has talked about this for a long time, and he said that he would empower local law enforcement to go after violent criminals, criminal gangs, MS-13, these types of things. Of course, they need to be first to go, and Bukele has certainly shown us the way there. But then when it comes to your general illegals, you just move down the ladder. And I think by and large, by the way, once they see the regime shift in the United States, you'll see a lot of self-deportation. And you saw a lot of self-deportation in the first Trump administration as well, because once they realized because remember, these are economic migrants. They're not refugees. They're not fleeing for, these are sham asylum concerns. They're here for money. And so if you cut off the money, you'll see millions and millions of people self-deport. That's number two. And then as far as number three, when you mentioned about legal immigrants, look, we are going to have to look at these some questions. If not, wouldn't be deportation for someone who's got a legal remit to be here, but we certainly have to look at a lot of these programs. The H-1B program, we looked at the J-1 summer program. We should have to look at these agricultural worker, low-wage worker programs, and really decide whether or not if it's in the best interest for our country to continue them.
We saw this week 8 people being arrested around America for links to the Islamic State. How much of a threat do you think immigration is to the United States?
Well, look, I'll just say this with my experience as being an intelligence officer, having served at Guantanamo Bay in the interrogation cell there, that if you were a terrorist, if you were running one of these operations and you wanted to do damage to the United States, so after the events of 9/11 that we suffered in 2001, the first thing that we talked about was airline safety. And we instituted the Transportation Security Administration. Everybody loves them so much, the TSA. And now people have to take their shoes off, et cetera, et cetera. But look at it a different way. If you're able to train people to get into a country, to get onto that plane or go and do something else, what's the very first thing the Biden administration does? Once you come into the US, you cross the border, they process you, they ask you, where would you like to go? And then they give you a plane ticket to wherever you might want to fly in the country. So all I've got to do now is get maybe 10 of my buddies. We all go on the same plane. Now we can take complete control of that aircraft. We could do 9/11 again immediately. It is one of the, I would say, airline security right now in this country, because of the illegal immigration problem, is the worst that it's been since September 10th, 2001.
When it comes to Joe Biden, we saw him at the G7 recently, kind of wandering around with the other world leaders. You had Giorgia Meloni kind of bringing him back in. Who do you think really is running the show when it comes to the White House?
Look, typically when we report over at Human Events on the White House, in any given situation, the Biden administration, people need to understand that Joe Biden is there as a face. He's not making the decisions. This is a classic example of a corporation with a CEO that everyone recognizes, but is really in control by the harpies in the HR department. And that's really what you have going on. So it's usually the loudest voice in the room. You have a military that's being controlled by Austin. You have foreign policy that's being controlled by Blinken and, until recently, Victoria Nuland. You've got education that's being run directly by the teachers' unions at this point. And you've got a lot of war policy as pertains to the Middle East being controlled by the political arm, worried about Joe Biden standing with Muslim Americans, as opposed to what actually the United States should be doing in terms of the conflict that we see between Israel and Gaza. And so really, you've got some of the wokest, some of the youngest, some of the most shrill, far left people in the entire country that were hired by this administration. Those are the ones actually in charge. It's not Joe Biden at all.
How concerned are people within the White House when it comes to Biden's health and his mental abilities?
You know, it's very interesting. There was a push a while ago. We used to refer to it as the shade war between Kamala and Joe Biden, because they were worried that she would try to sort of push him out and usurp him on the ticket. But it really was Jill Biden, at the time Jen Psaki, his former chief of staff, Ron Klain, who held the line to keep Biden in there, and really just Biden himself, very stubborn, saying he refused to go. There was a huge push internally to try to get him out. And then Steve Ricchetti moved from the campaign side over to the new chief of staff role. And so they've decided to put him in there, and they are going to keep him up as long as possible. They're very concerned. That's why they're trying to limit his travel. They're trying to limit his public appearances as much as possible. And I'll tell you, they're actually very worried about this debate, which is going to be here in about 2 weeks, the first debate between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. They're very worried about his performance that day. I've actually said as a sort of joke that what Trump should do in terms of strategy is actually show up late for the debate, because that way whatever muscle relaxers and beta blockers that they give Biden will have worn off. And so when he takes the stage, he'll be on the back end of the dopamine drop.
Do you think that Trump should enact revenge on the Democrats?
Well, I do think there needs to be a balancing. I think there needs to be a balancing of the scales. And right now, currently, with the things that the lawfare that the Democrats have conducted, not just to Donald Trump, as everyone knows, but also to people like Stephen K. Bannon, who was the chief strategist of the White House and the manager of the first presidential campaign for Trump, to people like Roger Stone, people like Peter Navarro, who's been an absolute China hawk when it comes to trade, who is currently behind bars in Miami, Florida right now. I think there needs to be a balancing. And I think that when it comes to injustice, it must be responded to by justice. And if you simply wash your hands of it, that it will not change the situation. And actually, we have a whole book about this that we just wrote called it's called Unhumans: The History of Communist Revolutions. And this is what we talk about, that if you do not increase the price of the use of lawfare, the use of injustice, that it will continue. It will not stop until it's stopped.
We will get into that in a moment. I just want to very briefly ask about Gen Z Trump supporters. We saw Logan Paul recently interview the former president. Do you think there's a vibe shift on the right among Gen Z?
There is a vibe shift. There's a vibe shift because, particularly among young men, and because for young men, they're told that, don't be confrontational, do whatever you're told in school, follow the rules, stay within line, don't say anything edgy, don't say anything that steps out of line, be woke, go along with DEI and all of it. And now suddenly Gen Z is getting into the workforce and they're starting to get out of college and realizing, okay, we followed all the rules, but wait a minute, the world is not giving us the things that they promised. And then, oh, by the way, the world will turn around, and who do they attack? It's young men. And they will say now men are the problem. Young men are the reason the world is in the shape it's in. Young men are the reason that women are not getting ahead, even though we've already seen that women now have higher salaries than men. Women have higher graduation rates than men. It's women that have gotten all of the programs, all of the help, and young men are told that they are still told that they are the anchors holding back young women. And I think that a lot of people are just saying, you know what? We tried to follow the rules. We did what we said. We're sick of it. We're done. We're going with Trump.
But this Logan Paul thing, it seems like he was a few years ago supporting BLM.
Oh, yeah. He was full woke, BLM, all of it.
So what's going on? Why are these big Gen Z celebrity types shifting to Trump?
Well, I think they're seeing the rise of the anti-establishment. And so the rise of the anti-establishment means, look, talk about wokeness, talk about BLM. If every corporation in the world and every institution and every Hollywood celebrity and every government politician is supporting you and your issue, you're not oppressed. You are, in fact, the ruling class. And if you want to be someone who's got that youthful rebelliousness, if you've got that youthful energy, or if you're just sick of being told what you have to say, what you're not allowed to say, how you have to think, how you're not allowed to think, and you've been screwed up and twisted up your whole life, that finally the real birth of freedom, the real birth of liberty it's not, in the United States, we talk about, it's eating bacon and flying the flag and shooting guns. It may express itself as that, for sure, and I certainly do. But it starts in your mind. And so people are sick of the internal illiberal nature of thought control that's going on in our countries, and they're decided to throw it completely to the gutter and embrace real freedom. And I think that's what Logan Paul and a lot of these people are responding to.
Do you like democracy?
Well, democracy is interesting. Here in the United States, we have a republic, and I think the republic gets it just about right. I think if you have full-on absolute democracy, where everyone in the majority is able to vote to take away the rights of others, then certainly there's a problem with that. I believe in individual rights and the protection of those rights. I believe those rights are endowed by God. And if something is going wrong in your society, whereby the majority is taking those rights away, then that needs to be corrected.
Would you prefer a system of monarchy or dictatorship, ideally?
Ideally, no, I don't think so, because I think what we have in society now with a stronger, a much more robust middle class, it's given way to a system where people are able to participate in a republic. But I do think that we need a stronger return to those Republican values.
You tweeted today, it's a Friday today, so I've got a quote from your Twitter. To defeat communism, you must defeat the communists.
Yes.
Franco Friday has commenced.
Yes.
What do you mean by this?
Well, Franco Friday. So Francisco Franco is, throughout the book, what we're doing is each chapter is a different story in the history of anti-communism. So there's a chapter on Spain, there's a chapter on Russia, there's a chapter on China, there's a chapter on France. And Franco was the man who in Spain was able to defeat communism. He was the one who rallied his people. He rallied and had the full support of the church, by the way. He had the full support of not only the military, but the religious factions of all of society, saying they wanted what was being done to them was so horrific by the Spanish Rojos. What was being done to them by their own government needed a correction. Now, is that the same thing that we would need in the United States or we need in other countries? No, of course not. But it's also an understanding of that when the government goes too far, it needs a correction.
You talk about a correction. There was obviously this white terror in Spain where tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of political enemies of Franco were murdered by him and sort of his kind of monarchist and perhaps even fascist kind of movement. He also banned the free press. He banned political parties. He became a sort of dictator. So I presume you're not advocating for those things or defending those things in some ways.
Well, what I'm saying is that when you are faced with a situation, and people know the litany of Franco, but they won't sit down and talk about the thousands of people who were killed by the communists, the thousands of journalists that were killed by the communists, the thousands.
Say that both are bad.
Sure, you could certainly say that that they're both true. That they're both true things that happen, and for every action, it's a law of physics where every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. It's Newtonian. And so what I'd like to say is I would never want to get to a situation where a horrific civil war opens up like that. But unfortunately, in the United States specifically, it feels like we're going along those roads. And when we see a government that's locking up political opponents, that's locking up even their own chief political contender for the presidency, this tends to give people this idea that perhaps democracy isn't working and they might want to go to other means.
The left like to accuse the right of being fascists.
All day long.
Nazis. Do you think that supporting Franco in this way kind of fuels their accusations?
No, I don't think so, because if you look at the history, Franco, of course, doesn't participate in the Second World War. Franco protected the Jews of Spain. Franco did remain neutral for Spain throughout all of society. And so when you're looking at a situation where you have a true understanding of what actually went down, you can say there's a little bit of the sort of caricature version that people like to, and the same way they do with Donald Trump, the same way they do with so many figures in history. It's easy to rail against that caricature, but if you look into the actual history, it's not quite the same.
I think it's undeniable he did kill tens of thousands of people. I mean, even sort of...
He certainly did.
Yeah.
It was a war.
These mass graves of, well, absolutely.
There's mass graves of nationalists as well. And mass graves of nuns. There's mass graves of priests. There were times where even nuns their bodies were taken, their skeletons hung up in the central square. And so I'm not Spanish, I'm Polish by background, but the Spaniards are not exactly known for holding back.
That's true. How important is the Second Amendment? You talk about civil war.
I do.
When it comes to protecting your political freedoms.
Well, the old adage in the United States, the Second Amendment is there to protect the First. And I do think that it's something the United States holds in high regard, and it's important. In fact, we just saw a Supreme Court ruling today that affirmed a piece of legislation that actually Trump had put in regarding a ban on a certain type of accessory that people put on their firearms called a bump stock. And the Supreme Court struck that down in terms of the Second Amendment because it's something that's indelibly pure. I'll put it this way. The Second Amendment is the right of self-defense. And it's the right to defend yourself, it's the right to defend your family, and it's the right to defend your freedom and liberty. So those rights that I were talking about earlier, I don't quite know how you could have a form of Republican government without it.
I want to talk a bit about conspiracy theories.
Sure.
The left love to accuse the right of spreading conspiracy theories.
Yes. And they're the biggest conspiracy theorists to begin with. We're all Russians. We're all, secretly working for Vladimir Putin. We're inviting the submarines into the harbor at Mar-a-Lago.
So this is the thing, right? So when the left are spreading their own kind of conspiracies and fake news and disinformation and so on, perhaps some people on the right can react to that by wanting to believe things that are slightly, I would say, outrageous.
Well, I also think that when there's a situation where we've been lied to by so many times by our government, by our media, by our institutions, that it really leads to people to questioning what they believed was true.
Right. And one of the conspiracy theories, I think, and perhaps you were involved in this, was the Pizzza Gatey conspiracy.
Right.
Do you regret your role in sort of spreading that?
Well, what I regret is the fact that they completely lied about everything that I said and did. If you notice, whenever they play those videos, they never actually play anything that I'm saying. They just say, "Oh, he went there." And really, the way we went to it was in a perspective of hopefully debunking it and saying that, we think this is just a place. So if you watch the video, we just go in and we order some food and sit down. That's all we actually did. And then, of course, the Washington Post comes in and CNN comes in and the rest, he's promoting it. And that wasn't even the truth at all. But that being said, when you have when you live now in a post-Jeffrey Epstein world, in a time where we know that there was an industrial level pedophile operation that was being run, including some of the highest members of world governments that were being taken down to this island in the Caribbean. Once you know that was actually true, it really does make you ask a lot of questions about what's really going on behind the doors of government.
When do you think the right goes too far?
Well, I think the right has a tendency to be reactionary. And I think that is something that goes too far. I've heard people say, we should, pick up the guns and just go for it. And inevitably, when you go to one of these conferences, there'll be someone, probably a Fed, who's talking like that. When's the go code coming, Poso? When's it coming? And I say, look, what we advocate is reciprocity, not reactionary. Reciprocity means exact reciprocity. So the reciprocity of, if I'm being accused of something by, that's completely faulty by Hunter Biden and his family, that I'm gonna sue Hunter Biden, or I'm gonna find information that will put him under investigation, or we're gonna go after his dealings with Burisma. But it's gonna be localized and individualized on these select targets. And I do think that there is a tendency towards reactionaryism because it feels like the situation is so grim, and it feels like there's so much power on one side, and the power imbalance is so, the coefficient is so drastic. But I would say, look at what we were just talking about Gen Z, or we say Gen Z here, but, I see a lot. I'm more white-pilled than I am black-pilled, if that makes sense.
Do you feel a certain responsibility as someone with a large following on social media, who has a large influence amongst conservative media organizations and so on, to make sure that you're sort of triple fact-checking everything you're putting out, and making sure that you're not spreading any conspiracies in any way, because people believe this stuff, and as you say, the results of that could be an extreme reaction. People, they've got weapons in America, they're not afraid to use them in some cases. So do you feel a certain sense of responsibility when you're sort of tweeting these things and so on?
Oh, of course. And that's why we always fight with truth on our side. And that's the best tool of all, because the best weapon of all as well, because when we explain the truth of what's going on in this country, the truth of the elites that have been screwing over the little guy, been screwing over the working class, screwing over the middle class, when they're hooking themselves up to these transnational organizations like the World Economic Forum, which has been totally riddled with CCP corruption, that we're able to do so in such a way where we're explaining the truth, we're exposing the lies. Dr. Fauci is someone we were ridiculed for years for saying that Dr. Fauci might be involved in the creation of COVID-19. Now, people will say, Anthony Fauci's there with a petri dish and conducting these gain of function. No, but when we lay out the actual system of facts, I remember being with Steve Bannon on January of 2020, talking about the Wuhan Institute of Virology, talking about Shi Zhongli, and we're slammed with the conspiracy theory label, and every single piece of that has actually turned out to be more true than we thought it was at the time.
You talk about Steve Bannon now. He's obviously facing a prison sentence.
2 weeks.
Trump was convicted recently, and you mentioned others, Roger Stone, who had the law come after them. In reaction to that, who do you think Trump and other Republicans should go after on the Democrat side? Do you think Anthony Fauci should be arrested? Do you think that Hillary Clinton should go to prison? Do you think Joe Biden should be arrested and so on?
Well, I do think it needs to be exact reciprocity. So when I look at people who directly need to be arrested, and again, I don't want to be reactionary about this. I want reciprocity. And so, sure, I could easily name off a list of, a couple of the top Democrats. But what I would say is, you really have to look at people. I'll give you an example. Hunter Biden's laptop was recently proven as true in a Wilmington, Delaware court, where he was up on these gun charges, but not really for much of the actual content of his business and dealings in Ukraine, etc. But the laptop was proven to be true. Well, we now know that the letter that was circulated by the Biden administration and Biden campaign at the time to 51 intelligence officials to come out saying that it was false, saying that it was a hallmarks of Russian disinformation, was actually circulated by Tony Blinken. And my question then is, did Tony Blinken claim this as a campaign expense? Because the exact conviction that Donald Trump is going to jail for, or potentially going to jail for in New York State, is not declaring these payments to Stormy Daniels as an election expense. So my question would be then, we should launch an investigation directly into Tony Blinken for the question of was this declared as a campaign expense? And if not, then take that crime and apply it directly to him. Again, Jake Sullivan, now he's the Secretary of State. Jake Sullivan, same thing, all the way back in 2016. He was the one who put together the Steele dossier, Christopher Steele and Orbis Enterprises, which turned into and launched this crazy Russiagate conspiracy theory and all these investigations. We know already, by the way, that was not declared as a campaign expense. It was declared as, and this, you're going to love this, it was declared as a legal expense. This is the same thing that Donald Trump's payments to Stormy Daniels through Michael Cohen were declared as. So where's the investigation, criminal investigation? Because again, it has to be a crime against Jake Sullivan for the same thing. So when we can find instances like these, this is off the top of my head, those are two, where where we can see the exact same crime being committed on the other side, we must press in.
You're originally from Poland, or your family were?
Family yeah.
were. And you mentioned the European election results. I know that the Conservatives did very well in Poland. Confederacja, I think they got about 12%. Peace got about 36%. And across all of Europe,
but can they work together? That's the real question.
A good question.
Yeah.
Across all of Europe, right-wing kind of populist movements did fairly well. In France, in particular, they did very well. Do you think that's a prelude to Donald Trump's election in November?
Well, we saw this in 2016, as I referenced earlier, that there was the Brexit vote in June and then Trump's vote in November. So a summer vote in Europe presaging a vote in America along these populist nationalist lines. I believe there's something going on that's worldwide, and I've spoken recently in Hungary. I go to Poland frequently. I was in Spain recently, talking about all of these things, and you can feel that energy. That 2016 energy is back. I didn't feel that in 2020. In 2020, we were locked down and dour, and everyone was wondering what was going to come next. But right now, it feels like there's a vibrancy and a strong culture. You're talking about Gen Z responding to this, a lot of Gen Z influencers responding to this and really getting on that. The energy is there, the vibe is there, and I think we are positioned for that in the United States if we're able to have a fair election.
Thank you so much, Jack, for joining us.
God bless.
Awesome. I'm sure we'll see a lot of Gen Z people here today.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.